The Valori hegemony had ruled the Aryan arm for 60,000 years, and in all that time they had never once been wrong about a primitive species. High Arbiter Kethvan stood on the observation deck of his flagship, the Endless Dominion, and watched the small blue planet spin slowly in the darkness of space. Such a pretty world, he said to his second-in-command, a tall creature named Vorath, who had served under him for 3 centuries. It is almost a shame that they wasted it on such limited beings. Vorath nodded his long, narrow head and brought up the scan results. On the holographic display that floated between them, Category 7 Civilization. High Arbiter, Vorath reported in his deep, rumbling voice. They've achieved basic space travel, but only within their own solar system, and their methods are laughably crude. Chemical rockets. Kethvan said with a sound that might have been a laugh if the Valori had been capable of true humor. They still burn fuel to push themselves through the void like animals throwing rocks to move forward. The High Arbiter had overseen 43 successful integrations in his long career, and each one had followed the same pattern. First came the discovery of a new world with intelligent life. Then came the assessment of their technological level. Then came the offer of guided integration, which was really just a polite way of saying that the primitive species would surrender everything and accept hegemony rule or face complete destruction. And finally came the submission, because no species had ever been foolish enough to refuse. The Valori fleet consisted of 200 warships, each one capable of destroying a continent with a single focused beam of energy that the humans could not even begin to understand. It was overkill of the highest order, but the hegemony believed in making strong first impressions. Have the cultural analysts completed their work? Kethvan asked as he turned away from the viewport. Yes, High Arbiter, Vorath replied. The humans are a fractured species with hundreds of different nations and languages and belief systems, but they share common traits that make them predictable, such as they are aggressive but fearful, and they value their individual lives above almost everything else, and they have a deep need to belong to something larger than themselves. Vorath explained, our analysts believe they will submit quickly once they understand the hopelessness of resistance. Kethvan made a satisfied sound deep in his throat. This would be an easy integration, and perhaps he could return home before the next cycle of the twin moons. But even as the High Arbiter contemplated the simple conquest ahead, something was troubling the technicians in the lower decks of the Endless Dominion. Senior technician Miraset had been scanning the planet for 3 standard days, and she had found something that did not make sense. Run the deep scan again, she ordered her assistant, a young Valori named Keleth, who had only recently completed his training. I have run it 14 times already, Keleth protested. The results do not change. Miraset stared at the readings on her screen and felt something she had not experienced. In 200 years of service, she felt uncertain. The scan showed structures buried deep beneath the surface of the planet, scattered across multiple continents and hidden under oceans and ice. These structures were made of materials that did not match any element in the hegemony's vast database. They were arranged in geometric patterns of impossible precision, and they were giving off energy signatures that suggested they were not dead, but merely sleeping. What do you think they are? Keleth asked in a whisper, as if he was afraid someone might hear them. Remains of a predecessor species, most likely, Miraset replied, though she did not sound convinced of her own words. The galaxy is full of dead civilizations, and sometimes we find their bones. But these readings suggest the structures are still active in some way. Dormant. Miraset corrected him. There is a difference between dormant and active, and these readings show something that has been dormant for a very long time. She should report this to the High Arbiter. Standard protocol demanded that any anomalous readings be brought to the attention of the commanding officer before first contact was initiated. But Miraset had seen what happened to technicians who delayed integrations with concerns that turned out to be nothing they were reassigned to mining vessels. In the outer reaches where careers went to die, file the readings as sensor artifacts caused by the planet's unusual magnetic field. She told Kelleth, "They are probably nothing." Kelleth hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded and did as he was told far below on the surface of the planet called Earth. Humans went about their daily lives without any idea that their fate was being decided by beings they had never met in a small apartment in New York City. A young woman named Sarah Chun was having strange dreams about vast dark shapes rising from the ocean in a research station in Antarctica. A team of scientists had just discovered a section of ice that seemed to be melting from the inside despite the freezing temperatures in Peru. An old man who had spent his life studying the Nazca lines felt the ground tremble beneath his feet in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing, and in the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean, in a trench so dark that the light had never touched it. Something that had been sleeping for 4 billion years began to stir. It did not wake fully, not yet, but it became aware in a way. It had not been aware for a very long time, sensed the ships hiding behind the moon, and it recognized what they represented. It had seen their kind before, countless times across countless ages young. Civilizations that thought themselves all-powerful species, that thought themselves supreme conquerors, who did not know that the universe had rules they could not break. The something in the darkness did not feel anger or fear or excitement. It felt only a deep and patient certainty. The children of Earth had grown enough to attract attention from the wider galaxy, and that meant the time of waiting was almost over. Soon they would face their first real test, and when they did, the something in the darkness would be ready to show them what they truly were on, the endless dominion. High Arbiter Kethvon gave the order to prepare the first contact message. Had no idea that he was not the hunter in this situation. He was the examined. The real power in this solar system had been watching and waiting long before his ancestors had learned to walk upright. The message came on every frequency at once, and it reached every device on Earth that could receive a signal. Television screens flickered and showed the face of High Arbiter Kethvon, a being with gray skin stretched tight over a skull that was too long, and eyes that were too large, and a mouth that moved in ways that did not match the words being spoken. "People of Earth," the translated voice said with the calm authority of someone who had delivered this speech many times before. "You are not alone in the universe, and the time has come for you to join the greater community of civilized species across the planet." 8 billion humans stopped what they were doing and listened. Some fell to their knees and prayed. Some screamed and ran into the streets. Some sat in silence and simply stared at the alien face that looked back at them with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. The Valori hegemony has governed this region of space for 60,000 of your years. The High Arbiter continued. "We offer you the gift of integration into our great civilization, and in exchange we ask only that you accept certain reasonable conditions. The conditions were not reasonable. Humanity would surrender all territorial claims beyond the atmosphere of Earth. Humanity would accept hegemony, oversight of their governments and economies and militaries. Humanity would submit to genetic cataloging and social restructuring to ensure optimal compatibility with hegemony standards, and humanity would do all of this within 30 of their days, or face consequences that the message did not specify, but strongly implied would be severe. In the United Nations building in New York, emergency sessions began within hours of the broadcast. The Secretary General, a tired woman named Margaret Okonkwo, who had spent her career dealing with human conflicts, now found herself trying to coordinate a response to something no one had ever prepared for. "We cannot fight them," the Russian ambassador said flatly. "Our weapons are toys compared to what they must possess. We cannot surrender either," the American ambassador argued. "Do you really want to hand over our entire species to aliens we know nothing about? What choice do we have?" The Chinese ambassador asked. They have 200 ships behind the moon, and we have no way to reach them, even if we could harm them." The debate went on for days while the clock ticked toward the deadline in military command centers around the world. Generals and admirals ran simulation after simulation and found the same result every time: total defeat in less than 6 hours. Humanity's nuclear weapons would be useless against ships that could simply move out of the way or shoot the missiles down from orbit. Humanity's fighter jets and bombers could not even reach space, let alone engage enemies who traveled between stars. There was no scenario in which Earth won, and there was barely any scenario in which Earth survived. But while the leaders of humanity argued and planned and despaired, something else was happening, something that no one had predicted in Peru. Professor Carlos Mendez had been studying the Nazca Lines for 37 years, and he had never felt the ground shake the way it was shaking now. The tremors came in patterns that repeated every few minutes, and they seemed to be getting stronger when he pressed his hand to the dry earth. He could swear he felt something pushing back in the Pacific Ocean. The nuclear submarine USS Montana was on a routine patrol when its sonar operator detected something impossible. "Captain," the young sailor said with a trembling voice, "I am picking up a sound from below us." "What kind of sound?" "It sounds like a heartbeat, sir." The captain looked at the sonar display and saw a pulse of sound rising from a depth that should have been nothing but empty water and bare rock. The pulse came again and again in a steady rhythm that grew louder with each repetition. In Antarctica, the team of scientists led by Dr. Elena Vasquez had been drilling ice cores when they discovered something that made no sense beneath 3 miles of ancient ice. Their instruments detected a structure made of black stone that was not any kind of stone they recognized. The structure was warm despite being surrounded by ice that had been frozen for millions of years, and it was getting warmer. Sarah Chun woke up screaming for the third night in a row. Her dreams had become more vivid since the alien broadcast, and they were always the same. She saw vast shapes rising from the depths of the ocean, and she saw symbols carved into black walls that seemed to shift and change when she looked at them, and she heard a voice that spoke without words telling her that everything was about to change. She was not the only one across the world. Millions of people were having the same dreams and feeling the same strange certainty that something ancient was waking upon the endless dominion. High Arbiter Keth Von reviewed the reports from his observation teams with growing satisfaction. The humans are fracturing exactly as our analysts predicted. Vorath reported, "Some of their nations are already preparing to accept our terms, while others are calling for resistance that cannot possibly succeed. Give them time to understand their situation." Keth Von replied, "The deadline will focus their minds, and by the end of their 30 days, they will submit like all the others." He did not ask about the anomalous readings that Technician Miracet had dismissed as sensor artifacts. He did not know about the tremors in Peru or the heartbeat in the Pacific or the warm black stone beneath the Antarctic ice. He did not know that the humans were not the only intelligence on Earth, and they never had been in the deepest part of the ocean, in a trench where no light had ever reached. The something that had been sleeping for 4 billion years opened what might have been called an eye. It saw the ships behind the moon. It heard the ultimatum that had been delivered to its children, and it began to remember why it had come to this small blue world so long ago. It had planted seeds here when the universe was young. It had guided the development of life through mass extinctions and ice ages and the slow, patient work of evolution. It had watched the first humans walk upright, and it had watched them spread across the globe, and it had watched them reach for the stars with their crude rockets and their beautiful dreams. And now something had come to threaten them before they were ready. The Sentinel did not feel anger because anger was a young emotion, and it was very old. But it felt something that might have been called protective instinct if there had been a word for what it was. Its children were in danger, and that was unacceptable. The Time for sleeping was over. The time for hiding was done. Soon the Valori would learn what happened to those who threatened the children of Earth. And the children themselves would finally learn what they truly were. High Arbiter Kethvan had grown tired of waiting. 23 days had passed since his ultimatum, and the humans were still arguing among themselves. Like children who could not decide which toy to play with, they need motivation, he told Varth, as they stood on the command deck of the Endless Dominion. Send the burning sky to the coordinates I have selected and order them to demonstrate our capabilities. What target have you chosen, High Arbiter? A small island in their Pacific Ocean, Kethvan replied. It is uninhabited, so we will not kill any of them, but they will see what we can do, and they will understand that their choices are submission or extinction. The warship burning sky broke formation and moved toward Earth with the casual confidence of a predator that had never known. Defeat Captain Threneval commanded the vessel, and he had participated in dozens of demonstrations like this before. The process was simple: find a target that would make an impression without causing too many casualties, fire the primary weapon, and turn the target into glass and ash. Watch the primitive species realize that resistance was pointless. We are in position, the weapons officer reported. Target is a volcanic island with no sentient life forms detected. Fire. Captain Threneval ordered. The burning sky released a beam of concentrated energy that could have cracked a continent in half. The beam lanced down through the atmosphere, bright enough to be seen from space, powerful enough to vaporize everything it touched. And then something impossible happened. The beam stopped. It did not splash against a shield or scatter into harmless light. It simply stopped as if it had hit a wall that existed in dimensions the Valori instruments could not perceive. Captain Threneval stared at his display in confusion. What happened? He demanded. Fire again. The weapons officer fired again, and again the beam stopped in midair, and then the ocean began to rise. Not in a wave, but in a column, a pillar of water miles across that climbed toward the sky as if gravity had forgotten how to work it in the rising water. Something dark was visible, something massive, something that made the Valori warship look like a speck of dust floating next to a mountain. The Van structure that emerged from the Pacific Ocean was black as the void between galaxies, and it was covered in patterns that shifted and changed in ways that hurt to look at directly. It was not a building or a machine in any sense. The Valori understood it was something older than their civilization, and older than their species, and older than most of the stars in the sky on the command deck of the Endless Dominion. Every alarm in the system began to scream at once. High Arbiter, Voreth shouted over the noise. We are detecting an object of unknown origin rising from the planet's surface. I can see that. Kethvan snapped. What is it? I do not know, Voreth admitted with fear in his voice for the first time in 3 centuries. Our sensors cannot make sense of the readings, and the materials it is made of do not exist in our database. Before Kethvan could respond, something happened that would haunt the dreams of every Valori who witnessed Ida voice spoke. It did not use radio waves or sound or any form of communication the hegemony had ever encountered. It simply appeared in the minds of every sapient being within the solar system, bypassing technology entirely and speaking directly to consciousness itself. You have come far from your homeworld, the voice said, and it was neither loud nor soft, but it filled every corner of every mind it touched. You have built ships and conquered species and spread your dominion across the stars, and you believe this makes you powerful on the burning sky. Captain Threneval fell to his knees as the voice overwhelmed his thoughts on the Endless Dominion. Kethvan gripped the railing of the command deck so hard that his claws drew blood from his own palms on Earth. 8 billion humans heard the voice and felt something stir in the deepest parts of their minds. Something that recognized the speaker, even though they had never heard it before. I am the one who planted the seeds of life on this world. The voice continued. I watched the first cells divide and the first creatures crawl from the oceans, and the first minds developed the capacity for wonder. The black structure had fully emerged from the water now, and it hung in the sky above the Pacific. Impossibly huge and impossibly stable, as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions it chose to follow. I have waited 4 billion years for my children to grow strong enough to face the wider universe, and now you come to them with threats and ultimatums. Kethvon found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What are you? The voice did not answer directly, but images flooded into his mind. Saw beings of light, and thought that had existed when the universe was. Young, he saw them shaping galaxies and seeding planets with the building blocks of life. He saw them watching and waiting as intelligence evolved. Across countless worlds, he saw them choosing certain worlds for special attention. Worlds where they would plant more than seeds. Worlds where they would leave guardians to protect and guide, and wait on what remains of those who came before. The voice said, I am the sentinel of this world and the guardian of its children. And I have been sleeping in the dark places of this planet since before your ancestors learned to make fire. The burning sky tried to retreat, but found that it could not move. The endless Dominion tried to charge its weapons, but found that its power systems have gone completely dead. 200 Valori warships hung helpless in space, held in place by a force they could not see or understand or resist. You offered my children a choice between submission and extinction. The Sentinel said, but there is a third option you did not consider. Kethvon wanted to ask what that option was, but the words would not come. The Sentinel answered anyway. They can wake up. And on the planet below, something began to change. The dreams that had been plaguing humans for weeks suddenly became clearer. The symbols they had been seeing made sense now. Feelings they had been experiencing crystallized into understanding humanity was not a young species stumbling toward the stars. They were the children of beings who had shaped the universe itself, and the time had come for them to remember who they really were. The Valori fleet remained frozen in space, while something extraordinary happened on the planet below in every corner of Earth. Humans began to experience what could only be described as remembering Sarah. Chum sat in her small apartment in New York and suddenly understood what the symbols in her dreams meant. They were not random shapes, but a language. A language that her ancestors had known before they forgot. A language written into the very structure of her DNA. She held up her hand and watched in amazement as faint lines of light began to trace patterns across her skin in Antarctica. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood before the black structure her team had uncovered and felt knowledge pouring into her mind. The structure was a library. She realized a repository of information left behind by beings who had wanted their children to have access to everything they would need when the time came. She placed her palm against the warm black surface and felt it recognize Heron, Peru. Professor Mendez knelt on the ground above the Nazca lines and finally understood what they really were: not art and not religious symbols, but markers, indicators of something buried beneath the surface. Machinery that had been waiting millions of years to be activated all across the world. The same awakening was happening. A fisherman in Japan looked at his boat engine and suddenly knew how to make it run on principles that would have seemed like magic an hour before. A student in Kenya stared at her physics textbook and realized that everything in it was merely the beginning, the first stumbling steps toward truths that were now becoming clear in her Minda. Child in Brazil drew pictures of spacecraft that operated on technologies humanity had not yet invented, and when his mother asked where he had learned to draw such things, he simply said he remembered. The Sentinel observed all of this from its position above the Pacific and felt something that might have been called satisfaction. The knowledge was always within them. It broadcast to the watching Valori fleet, encoded in their cells and waiting for the right moment to emerge. High Arbiter Kethvan listened in horror as reports flooded in from his observation teams. The humans are changing, Vareth said, and there was pure terror in his voice now. Their brain activity is increasing beyond anything we have ever measured, and their technological output has jumped by orders of magnitude in the last hour alone. How is this possible? Kethvan demanded. The Sentinel answered him directly. 60,000 years ago, when your species was still learning to build permanent shelters, I chose this world for a special purpose. Images appeared in Kethvan's mind again, showing him things he did not want to see. He saw the Sentinel arriving at Earth when it was still a ball of molten rock. He saw it shaping the conditions that would allow life to emerge. He saw it guiding evolution. Through subtle interventions over billions of years, he saw it encoding information into the genetic structure of every human being. Compressed data that would remain dormant until it was needed. You call them primitive because they have not yet reached the stars, the Sentinel continued. But they are not primitive, and they never were. They are seeds, and now they are blooming in orbit around Earth. Something remarkable was taking shape. The humans had begun building within hours of their awakening, not with the slow, careful methods they had used before, but with new techniques that allowed them to construct in days what would previously have taken decades. Ships rose from the surface of the planet, vessels that looked nothing like the crude rockets humanity had used before. These new ships were sleek and strange, and they moved through the atmosphere without any visible propulsion. They folded space around themselves in ways that the Valori had always considered theoretically possible but practically unreachable. This is impossible, Kethvan whispered as he watched the human fleet grow larger by the hour. The Sentinel turned its attention to the High Arbiter specifically, and when it spoke again, there was something in its voice that might have been pity. You came here expecting to conquer a young species barely capable of leaving its own planet. Instead, you found the children of the architects, the beings who shaped this universe before your kind existed, the beings whose power you cannot imagine and whose legacy you are now witnessing. Kethvan searched the ancient records of the hegemony and found references to the architects buried in the oldest texts. They were spoken of as gods by species that had been ancient when the Valori were young. They had disappeared from the galaxy millions of years ago, either transcended to a higher plane of existence or simply moved on to whatever came after mortality. The hegemony had assumed they were gone forever. They had been wrong. I could destroy your fleet with a thought, the Sentinel said. I could erase your species from existence as easily as you might brush dust from your clothing. But that is not my purpose. My purpose is to protect and guide, and when the time is right to step aside. The Sentinel's massive form began to drift downward, sinking back toward the ocean from which it had risen. My children will decide what happens to you, it said. They are ready to make their own choices now, and I am ready to sleep again on Earth. Sarah Chun stood in a room full of people who were quickly becoming something more than human. They were connected now in ways they had never been before. Their minds linked by the knowledge that flowed through all of them, and they were looking up at the Valori fleet with new eyes, not with ferment, with anger, but with the calm certainty of a species that had just learned what it truly was. What do we do with them? Someone asked. Sarah considered the question and felt the answer rise up from the ancient knowledge that now lived within her. We show them, she said. We show them what we have become, and then we let them go home to tell the others. The human fleet rose to meet the Valori, and what followed was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the vessel that humanity had built in less than a week. A ship that operated on principles the Valori had spent 60,000 years trying to understand around her. A crew of 50 humans worked in perfect coordination, their minds linked through the gift the Sentinel had given them. Their weapons are coming online, one of her crew reported calmly. Sarah nodded and watched the Valori fleet on the display before. Our High Arbiter Kethvan had apparently decided to fight despite everything he had witnessed. Perhaps he could not accept what was happening. Perhaps he hoped that hegemony technology would still prove superior. Perhaps he simply did not know what else to do. Let them fire first, Sarah said. We need them to understand. The burning sky released its full arsenal at the human fleet, beams of concentrated energy that could crack planets in half, missiles that traveled faster than light itself, weapons that had never failed against any species the hegemony had encountered. The human ships did not dodge or shield themselves. They simply existed in a different way for a moment, shifting into a state where the weapons passed through them like light through glass, and then they shifted back, completely unharmed. Our turn, Sarah said. The human fleet moved and the Valori fleet stopped moving. Every ship in the hegemony Armada found itself held in place by forces that should not have existed. Every weapon system went offline. Every engine died. Every light flickered and faded. The 200 most powerful warships in the known galaxy had been rendered completely helpless in less than 3 seconds. This is High Arbiter Kethvan to any vessel that can hear me. A desperate voice crackled over the communications channel. We need assistance immediately. Sarah opened a channel to the Valori flagship. No one is coming to help you, she said, and her voice carried the weight of ancient knowledge that made the words more than just sound. Your fleet is the most powerful force the hegemony possesses, and we have neutralized it without firing a single shot. There was silence from the other end of the channel. We are not going to destroy you, Sarah continued. That was never our purpose, and it is not who we are. What do you want? Kethvan asked, and for the first time since he had arrived in this solar system, he sounded like what he truly was, a frightened being facing something far beyond his understanding. We want you to go home, Sarah replied. We want you to tell your leaders what happened here, and we want you to deliver a message. What message? Sarah looked out at the stars and felt the presence of the Sentinel deep below the Pacific Ocean. Sleeping now, but still aware, still watching, still ready to act if its children needed protection again. Earth is no longer a candidate for integration, she said. Earth is now under the protection of the Architect's legacy, and any species that threatens the worlds we watch over will face consequences they cannot imagine. The worlds you watch over, Kethvan repeated. There are others. Yes, Sarah felt the knowledge flow through her. Coordinates and locations and images of distant planets where life was growing, where intelligence was emerging, where young species were taking their first steps toward the stars. The architects had not planted seeds on Earth alone. They had seeded thousands of worlds across the galaxy, and now that humanity had awakened, they had a responsibility to those other worlds, a responsibility to protect and guide and watch over the younger species until they too were ready to wake up. We are sending you coordinates, Sarah told the High Arbiter. These are the locations of every world that is now under our protection, and there are many of them, on the endless dominion. Kethvan watched in stunned silence as a flood of data appeared on his screens. Thousands of star systems, thousands of primitive civilizations, all of them marked with a symbol that the Valori would learn to fear and respect. You will inform the hegemony that these worlds are off limits, Sarah said. Any attempt to integrate them will be treated as an act of aggression against humanity, and we will respond accordingly. The hegemony has ruled this region of space for 60,000 years, Kethvan said weakly. You cannot simply— We can, Sarah interrupted him, and there was no anger in her voice and no arrogance. Just simple certainty. And we are— Go home. High Arbiter, tell your people what you have seen, and make sure they understand that the universe has changed. The human ships withdrew, and the Valari fleet found that its systems were coming back. Online, they could move again. They could navigate. Again, they could go home. Kethvon gave the order to retreat, and for the first time in 60,000 years of hegemony dominance, a fleet fled from a species they had intended to conquer as the Valori ships disappeared into the darkness between stars. Sarah turned to look at the blue planet below Earth. Had changed forever in the span of a few weeks. Humanity had changed forever, and the universe would never be the same. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, the Sentinel settled into its ancient resting place and allowed itself to drift back towards sleep. Its purpose had been fulfilled. Its children had grown strong enough to protect themselves and strong enough to protect others. There would be challenges ahead. New threats, new obstacles, new tests, but that was how it should be. That was how children learned to become something greater than what they had been on the surface of Earth. Billions of humans looked up at the stars with new understanding. They had spent so long feeling small and alone and afraid. They had believed they were accidents of evolution, insignificant specks in an uncaring universe. They knew better now. They were the children of the architects. They were the inheritors of a legacy older than most stars. They were the guardians of emerging life across the galaxy and somewhere out there on thousands of distant worlds. Other children were growing up. Other species were learning to dream of the stars. Other civilizations were taking their first uncertain steps toward the light. Humanity would be watching over them. Humanity would be waiting for them, and when they were ready, humanity would welcome them as family, because that was what the architects had always intended, and that was what their children would always do. The stars had never seemed so bright.